Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of the mob. Lucky Luciano, the ruthless architect of modern organized crime. Alan Dulles, the calculating spy master of the CIA. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. These men never sat together in the halls of Congress, yet their decisions shaped the very future of America. They moved in silence, building alliances between gangsters, intelligence officers, and businessmen, creating a hidden empire that outlived wars, toppled governments, and controlled billions. This is the story of how criminals, spies, and power brokers merged into one force, the men who truly run America. In the beginning, America appeared to be a land guided by its constitution, its leaders elected by the people, its destiny shaped by liberty. Yet beneath the surface, something else stirred. A separate current of power was always flowing, invisible to most, but strong enough to direct the tide of the nation. This current was not made up of presidents or senators, but of men who thrived in secrecy, men who dealt not in ideals but in influence, profit, and control. They were the silent architects of decisions that would never be recorded in history books, but whose consequences shaped wars, economies, and societies. Their fingerprints could be found in corporate boardrooms, smoky back alleys, and quiet government offices. They were never supposed to be seen, and yet without them, America would not look the way it does today. As the nation celebrated democracy, these hidden figures mastered the art of shadow rule. They understood that true power was rarely found in speeches or parades. Real power lived in networks of favors, debts, and secrets. A man with a gun could silence one enemy, but a man with information could command an empire. These men thrived on information, on control of money, and on their ability to operate in the blind spots of the law. They created systems so entangled with politics and business that untangling them became impossible. Over time, it was no longer clear where the government ended and the underworld began. The roots of this hidden power stretched far back, even into the early days of the Republic. Wealthy merchants, corrupt officials, and criminal gangs found common cause in protecting their interests. When Prohibition came, the system only deepened. Liquor was illegal, but the thirst for it was unstoppable. Gangsters built underground networks to supply it, and politicians quietly looked the other way, so long as their campaigns were funded and their pockets lined. The men who controlled these operations learned an important lesson. The law was not a barrier, it was an opportunity. Every ban created a black market, and every black market created fortunes for those bold enough to take them. While the public believed in elections, justice, and the rule of law, another system worked silently beneath. It was a system built on bribes, threats, and handshakes. In the dark, judges could be bought, police could be bent, and businessmen could be turned into silent partners. It was a machine too large to be destroyed, because even those who swore to fight it often found themselves feeding from it. America's bright ideals became the perfect cover for those who wanted to use them as a mask. The true genius of the hidden hand was its ability to remain invisible. The average citizen could never imagine that crime families, intelligence agents, and corporate magnates were part of the same puzzle, yet their interests aligned in ways that served them all. Wars brought contracts. Contracts brought money, and money bought loyalty. This cycle repeated again and again, until the real rulers of the nation no longer needed ballots or headlines to prove their power. They existed behind the curtain, pulling strings so skillfully that the world on stage never noticed. By the time the 20th century began, America's story was already split in two. The one taught in classrooms of presidents and freedom, and the one whispered about of backroom deals, mobsters with government ties, and secret networks of wealth. It was a story no one was supposed to tell, because to tell it was to reveal that the land of liberty was also the land of shadows, and in those shadows, the men who ran America had already taken their seats. What made these criminal empires different was their vision. They were not content with quick profits or violent robberies. They sought stability, longevity, and influence. They understood that violence alone could not secure power. Only structure could. Syndicates were born, alliances formed, and territories divided with the precision of corporations. The Mafia became not just a group of criminals, but an institution that operated like a parallel government. It had its own rules, codes, and methods of enforcement. And like any government, it needed relationships with those in authority to survive. Politicians quickly realized that fighting these new powers outright was nearly impossible. Police could raid speakeasies, but there were too many. Judges could issue rulings, but witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. And so deals began to happen. Campaign envelopes swelled with gangster money, promises were exchanged behind closed doors, and the law bent just enough to let the machine keep turning. The men who smuggled liquor were no longer just criminals, they were financiers, sponsors, and kingmakers. They could decide who rose to power in city halls, state legislatures, and eventually even in Washington. As money poured in, crime families diversified. They moved into unions, construction, trucking, and real estate. Each industry gave them more control over daily life and more leverage over government contracts. A dock strike could paralyze trade. A rigged bid could determine who built entire neighborhoods. Every decision added another layer of influence, another string to pull when needed. In this way, organized crime wove itself into the fabric of the nation, no longer just tolerated, but depended upon by the very people sworn to fight it. By the 1930s, the mob had become part of the American landscape. Figures like Al Capone were only the public face, loud and notorious. The real power rested with quieter men, those who avoided the cameras, who built relationships with bankers and politicians instead of flaunting their wealth in nightclubs. These were the men who thought in decades, not days. Their vision was not about bootlegging alone. It was about legacy, about creating dynasties that could endure long after Prohibition ended. The end of alcohol bans did not mean the end of their power. On the contrary, it forced them to expand further into legitimate industries, blending criminal wealth with respectable business. By the time Prohibition was repealed, the mob was no longer an outlaw group hiding in the shadows. It had become a parallel empire, deeply connected to the economy and the political system. The lesson had been learned well. Every law creates opportunity, and those bold enough to seize it could rise from street hustlers to kingmakers. The American dream, for them, was not about freedom or justice. It was about control, and they were learning exactly how to take it. When the Second World War erupted, America faced enemies across oceans and fears of sabotage at home. Factories, ports, and shipping lines became lifelines of war, and protecting them was a national priority. But behind the patriotic posters and military planning, another kind of alliance was being formed, one that would forever change the relationship between organized crime and the American government. On the docks of New York, whispers spread of foreign agents ready to cripple supply lines. The U.S. Navy, desperate to secure the waterfront, turned not to politicians or businessmen, but to mob bosses. In exchange for leniency and protection, the Mafia agreed to keep the ports safe, to ensure that no foreign saboteurs could interfere with the war effort. For the first time, organized crime was not just tolerated, it was enlisted. This cooperation was not simply about securing one harbor. It was a test, and the results were undeniable. The gangsters delivered. Workers who might have struck during crucial months suddenly kept quiet. Dockyards that had been chaotic became disciplined. Ships sailed without delays. The Navy learned that criminals could accomplish tasks with speed and efficiency that official channels could not. In return, gang leaders gained more than money. They gained leverage. The government that once branded them as enemies now owed them favors. This quiet partnership would not end with the war. It would only grow stronger. At the same time, America's intelligence community was beginning to take shape. Agencies needed informants, fixers, and connections in places where official agents could never go. Who better than the underworld, already skilled in smuggling, secrecy, and violence? Whether moving weapons through black markets or gathering intelligence in foreign ports, criminals provided access to networks that no government official could enter. War blurred the lines between patriotism and profit. What mattered was results, not legality. For the intelligence officers who worked with them, the arrangement was equally seductive. Covert operations required funding that Congress would never approve, and criminals had endless cash streams. Missions that needed plausible deniability required actors outside official government channels, and the mob fit the role perfectly. The bond between spies and syndicates was not just a wartime necessity, it was the birth of a long-term alliance. When victory came in 1945, the world celebrated peace, but in America a darker seed had been planted. Organized crime had proven its usefulness, and the intelligence community had tasted the benefits of working with men outside the law. Once those doors had been opened, they could never truly be shut again. What began as a desperate wartime pact had transformed into a permanent web of shared interests. It was no longer clear who was using whom, the government or the mob. Together, they had learned a dangerous truth. When power is shared in the shadows, it becomes almost impossible to untangle. The war ended, but the networks it created did not disappear. Instead, they evolved into something far more powerful. With the Cold War rising, America built a new machine of secrecy, the Central Intelligence Agency. Its mission was to protect democracy from the spread of communism, but from the very beginning, its methods were not bound by law or morality. It needed funds that could not be traced, allies who could not be named, and operations that could never be acknowledged. To achieve this, the agency turned again to the world it had already tasted during the war, the hidden world of smugglers, mobsters, and shadow financiers. In the name of national security, the government's own guardians became entangled with the very criminals they once claimed to fight. The post-war years created endless opportunities for these partnerships to grow. Europe lay in ruins. Asia was reshaping itself, and secret wars were erupting across the globe. The CIA required safe houses, transport routes, and financial channels that no official system could provide. Organized crime already had all of these. Drug syndicates could move shipments across borders faster than any diplomat. Black market dealers could provide weapons without fingerprints. Corrupt bankers could wash money clean before it ever reached an agent's hands. To outsiders, these were outlaws. To intelligence officers, they were tools reliable, effective, and always willing for the right price. Every covert mission added new layers to this relationship. Coups in foreign countries, assassinations of leaders, the creation of proxy armies, all required channels of funding and logistics that could not exist in daylight. The mob became more than a partner. It became a silent arm of American power. Gangsters, once feared only in neighborhoods, now shaped the destinies of entire nations. A hidden network was forming, one that linked intelligence chiefs in Washington with mafia bosses in New York and heroin smugglers in Asia. Each player needed the others, and together they built an empire that operated above the law. The greatest danger was not just the corruption of individuals, but the merging of systems. The CIA and the underworld began mirror each other. Both relied on secrecy, loyalty, and silence. Both thrived in places where official oversight could not reach, and both understood that information and money were more powerful than weapons. This mirrored structure allowed them to cooperate almost seamlessly. An order whispered in Washington could be carried out by criminals thousands of miles away, leaving no trace of official involvement. By the mid-1950s, the web of intelligence and organized crime was no longer temporary. It was permanent. A structure that survived changes in presidents, policies, and wars. It had grown too useful, too profitable, and too deeply embedded to ever be undone. What began as a mission to protect the nation had transformed into something else entirely, a machine of power that belonged not to the people, but to the men who could control the shadows. And in those shadows, the lines between empire and underworld had blurred until they were indistinguishable. By the 1960s, the shadow alliance that had begun in wartime secrecy found its most profitable frontier: drugs. At first, it was heroin, flooding in from the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. Later, cocaine surged from South America. These narcotics would devastate American cities, tearing apart families and fueling violence on the streets. But behind the chaos, the drug trade was being quietly shaped and protected by forces far above the street corner dealer. What appeared to be random criminal activity was in fact part of a hidden economy, one that connected intelligence networks, organized crime, and foreign policy into a single chain of power. This was no accident. Intelligence agencies understood the value of drug profits in financing operations that could never be traced. Cartels and syndicates were given safe passage, their rivals eliminated, their routes protected. To the public, it looked like law enforcement was waging a war on drugs. In reality, that war was carefully selective, targeting small players while leaving the larger machine untouched. Every arrest of a street dealer distracted from the fact that entire shipments were moving with silent approval. The underworld and the government had become partners in a trade that destroyed countless lives while fueling covert agendas overseas. For the mob, drugs represented the next stage of power. Bootlegging had given them a foundation, unions had given them leverage, but narcotics gave them limitless profit. With intelligence protection, they could move shipments without fear of serious interference. Banks quietly laundered billions, corporations unknowingly or knowingly absorbed drug money into their accounts, and politicians looked away. In return, the hidden alliance grew stronger, more interconnected, and more dangerous. The cost was visible in every American city. Crime rates soared, prisons filled, and entire generations were lost to addiction. Communities blamed dealers, unaware that the true architects of the epidemic sat in offices, not on street corners. The story told in newspapers was one of chaos, gangs, and moral decline. The story not told was one of deliberate design, where suffering became the price of secrecy and profit. By the 1970s, cocaine entered the scene, carried north from Colombia and later Mexico. Once again, intelligence networks and crime families found ways to exploit the trade. Governments needed deniable funding for secret wars in Latin America, and traffickers needed protection. Together, they built pipelines that turned powder into power. Every kilo that crossed the border represented not just money, but influence, an empire growing stronger beneath the surface of the nation. What began as a wartime partnership had evolved into a global narcotics machine. The so-called war on drugs was never meant to end the trade. It was meant to control it, to decide who benefited and who was sacrificed. The result was a tragedy written in broken homes and overcrowded morgues. But behind the curtain, the men who ran America grew richer, their empire now fed by addiction. By the 1980s, the underworld no longer looked like a shadowy figure in a fedora or a mob boss holding court in a smoky backroom. Its face had changed, and it wore expensive suits, silk ties, and polished shoes. Crime had matured, shedding its rough edges and disguising itself beneath the clean lines of corporate America. The billions made from narcotics, gambling, and smuggling needed to be cleaned, and laundering money through businesses became the perfect disguise. The same cash that once paid for illegal shipments now flowed into banks, skyscrapers, and multinational corporations. Crime families and cartels realized that real safety came not from guns or intimidation, but from legitimacy. Once the money entered the system, it became untouchable, and the men who controlled it could walk freely in boardrooms rather than alleys. Banks became the first essential partners. Financial institutions were eager for deposits, no matter their origin. Regulations were weak, oversight was minimal, and the hunger for capital made officials look the other way. Suitcases of cash crossed borders and were deposited in offshore accounts, hidden behind layers of shell companies and false identities. In many cases, bankers themselves became complicit, knowing full well the origins of the money but blinded by the fees and profits that came with it. What once would have been a scandal became standard practice, as financial systems absorbed billions in dirty money without a trace of hesitation. Real estate was the second pillar of this transformation. Towering glass buildings in major cities were not only monuments to modern capitalism, they were laundromats for the underworld. Criminal fortunes bought entire blocks of property, masking illicit gains as legitimate investment. Skyscrapers rose from foundations built on drug profits. Casinos were constructed with mob money, and luxury hotels became fronts for laundering operations. The cities that symbolized progress and prosperity often stood as silent evidence of how deeply the underworld had fused with legitimate business. By this point, crime had stopped being merely local, it had become globalized, moving through the same networks as trade and finance. Multinational corporations, some unwitting, others fully aware, became tools for laundering. Defense contractors received contracts funded by money that had originated in narcotics. Shipping companies moved both legal goods and illicit cargo along the same routes. Oil firms, mining corporations, and arms dealers all found themselves brushing shoulders with the shadow networks that funneled wealth across continents. The lines blurred until it was almost impossible to tell where business ended and crime began. This shift gave the hidden empire something it had never fully possessed before: invisibility. A gangster with a pistol could be arrested, a mobster running a casino could be indicted. But a corporate executive with clean accounts and legal paperwork was nearly untouchable. Power was now measured not in bullets but in contracts, not in street corners but in global markets. The men who had once been outlaws now sat in polished offices with government leaders respected and accepted as part of the economic elite. For the public, the illusion was perfect. News stories still portrayed organized crime as gangs fighting turf wars in the streets. What they did not see was the transformation taking place above them. The true empire no longer resembled crime at all. It had merged seamlessly with the system, wearing the mask of capitalism, and from behind that mask, the hidden network reached farther and held tighter than ever before. Every empire protects itself, and the hidden empire of crime and intelligence was no exception. By the time it had embedded itself into politics and business, secrecy became its strongest weapon. Anyone who threatened to pull back the curtain risked being silenced. Sometimes the silencing was subtle: a smear campaign, a sudden scandal, a ruined career. Other times, it was permanent, ending with a body found under mysterious circumstances. What the public saw were isolated tragedies or coincidences. What they did not see was the invisible hand removing obstacles to protect the machine. The mid-20th century became a graveyard of unanswered questions. Leaders who spoke too loudly about corruption found themselves discredited. Journalists who uncovered too much often suffered sudden accidents. Whistleblowers vanished into obscurity or ended up dead in ways investigators could never fully explain. Each event on its own seemed like a mystery. Together, they revealed a pattern. The hidden system defended itself with precision. It knew how to strike in ways that left no proof but always delivered a message. High-profile assassinations became turning points in American history, shaping the direction of the nation. Official stories often left gaping holes, fueling suspicion but rarely offering clarity. Investigations dragged on, but conclusions were murky, filled with contradictions and missing evidence. Commissions were formed, reports were written, but the truth remained buried. It was not incompetence that created the confusion, it was design. A web of cover-ups ensured that the full story never reached the public. Files were sealed, witnesses silenced, and narratives carefully controlled to protect those who had the most to lose. The hidden empire had no loyalty to ideology. It did not care about political parties or public opinion. Its loyalty was only to survival and profit. If a politician threatened its operations, he was removed, regardless of his affiliation. If a foreign leader resisted its influence, he became a target. Coups were staged under the banner of freedom, but behind them were the same interests that controlled narcotics pipelines and laundered fortunes through banks. Deaths that looked like isolated acts of violence were often threads in a larger tapestry of control. The ability to erase threats created an atmosphere of fear even among the powerful. Senators, governors, and CEOs understood that stepping too far out of line could carry consequences. Some cooperated willingly, others reluctantly, but few dared to oppose. The system thrived not only through violence, but through the chilling effect of knowing that violence could strike at any moment. Silence became the price of survival. For the average citizen, these stories were consumed as shocking headlines before fading into memory. People mourned assassinated leaders, debated conspiracies, and speculated about cover-ups. But they rarely grasped the scale of the system at work. They saw fragments of a puzzle without ever holding the full picture. And that was the intention. The true story lay hidden, protected by layers of disinformation and fear. By the late 20th century, the empire had mastered the art of erasure. It could eliminate enemies while presenting the illusion of justice, stage scandals to distract the public, and rewrite history to its advantage. The blood spilled in alleys, in hotel rooms, and on open streets was the cost of keeping the machine intact. Behind every unexplained death, every silenced witness, and every vanishing piece of evidence stood the men who understood one unbreakable rule: an empire built in shadows can only survive by ensuring the truth never comes to light. Today, the men who run America no longer need to operate in smoky backrooms or back alleys. Their empire has matured, blending seamlessly with the modern world. Instead of bootleggers and mobsters, the faces of power now belong to bankers, corporate executives, intelligence chiefs, and political strategists. The methods have changed, but the system remains the same. Control is still the goal, only now it is exercised through financial markets, digital surveillance, global trade, and carefully crafted policies. The machinery of influence has grown so vast and so refined that most people never notice it working around them. Wars are still fought, but the weapons have shifted. Economic sanctions replace armies, cyber operations replace assassins, and debt replaces bullets. The hidden empire has learned that domination no longer requires occupation, it requires control of resources, markets, and information. Entire nations can be bent to will without a single shot fired. Their leaders pressured through economic leverage or quietly removed when they resist. The same logic that once guided street-level rackets now governs international strategy. Where crime families once extorted small businesses, global institutions now dictate terms to entire countries. Intelligence agencies remain at the heart of this system. Their reach extends across borders, gathering not only military secrets but also financial data, corporate strategies, and private communications. Technology has become the new battlefield. Every phone call, email, and transaction leaves a trail, and those trails can be used to build profiles, predict behavior, and steer outcomes. Surveillance is no longer aimed only at enemies abroad, but at citizens at home, ensuring that dissent never grows strong enough to threaten the structure. What once required intimidation can now be achieved through algorithms and hidden monitoring. Money still fuels the machine, but it flows in ways far more sophisticated than ever before. Offshore banking havens shelter fortunes too large to trace, while multinational corporations act as shields for hidden ownership. The billions generated by narcotics, arms deals, and covert operations are disguised within legitimate investments. Hedge funds, real estate portfolios, and technological startups all become vessels for wealth that no regulator can fully untangle. To the public, these are symbols of progress and innovation. In reality, they are pieces of a network designed to protect and multiply the fortunes of the hidden empire. The most chilling transformation is how accepted it has all become. Unlike the mob bosses of the past, who could be vilified in newspapers, today's power brokers are celebrated as visionaries and leaders. Their foundations donate to charities. Their names appear on university buildings. Their companies sponsor cultural events. Respectability masks the shadows beneath. The empire has not only hidden itself, it has woven itself into the fabric of daily life. People admire the very institutions that quietly strip them of choice, independence, and truth. And so the cycle continues. What began with smuggled liquor and wartime pacts has grown into a global structure of domination. The empire does not need to announce itself because it is everywhere, in the price of oil, in the reach of technology, in the endless wars fought under shifting banners. It cannot be voted out, because it was never elected. It cannot be prosecuted, because it wears the armor of legitimacy. The men who run America no longer need to stand in shadows, they stand in plain sight, disguised as progress, steering the world toward a future designed only for themselves.